Hello everyone, and welcome to week 3 of our course on the history of artificial intelligence. And this week we arrive at one of the most important turning points in the history of AI. So in the early years of the field, which we covered last week with the pioneers, there was enormous excitement about the future of the discipline. Researchers believed that real machine intelligence might be closer than it actually turned out to be. But by the 1970s and 1980s, which is the focus of this week, week 3, that optimism was running into very serious problems. Some of the biggest promises of the early AI pioneers had not been fulfilled, and critics were beginning to ask whether or not the field had claimed too much too soon. So at first glance, this period can look something like a story of failure, and you may have heard the phrase AI winter before, but this suggests that the enthusiasm completely collapsed and the field went cold. But this week's materials are going to show that reality was actually much more complicated than that simple story of an AI winter. AI was criticized, absolutely yes. Some of its grand ambitions certainly fell short, but the field did not simply disappear. Instead, the field adapted. It pulled back a little bit. It narrowed some of its goals. It shifted some methods, and it found new ways to survive. So the central question for the week then is an important one. Did AI mostly fail in the 1970s and 1980s, or did it simply change and adapt? And I think our core reading materials this week and video materials will help us explore that question from several different directions, both contemporary from the 1970s and 1980s, and also from today, looking back on this period. So you're going to start in the core section of the learning materials this week with James Lighthill's 1973 Survey of Artificial Intelligence. And Lighthill suggests that one of the strongest, he comes across as one of the strongest early critiquers of the AI field. He had been around in the 1960s, so he was certainly aware of all the optimistic rhetoric surrounding AI. And he comes out in the first part of the 1970s and saying that AI had struggled when it moved beyond the very small controlled problems. And when AI began to face the complexity of the world, that's when we began to see the real limitations and failures of AI. So in many ways, this Lighthill reading captures the growing frustration of the period and helps to explain why the confidence in AI began to significantly weaken. But we're going to pair that with a different perspective, and the next reading comes from Thomas Haigh's essay entitled "There Was No First AI Winter," and this complicates the story that Lighthill told. Now, Haigh is writing in 2023, so this is exactly 50 years after Lighthill wrote his survey. And so obviously Lighthill is telling a contemporary story from the 1970s perspective. He's arguing about the present for him. Haigh has the benefit of 50 years of time in which he was able to look back and reflect upon this decade, or these 2 decades, from a much further perspective. So Haigh argues that this familiar idea that Lighthill was proposing of the total collapse is just far too simple of a story. AI did not freeze and vanish. Even when some of the boldest claims from AI ran into trouble, work still continued in universities, research communities, research centers, and related areas of computer science. And so this reading from Haigh really encourages us to think more historically and more carefully about what it really means when some people suggest that a field is in decline. Next for the core readings, we're going to take a trip back to 1982 and read William Gerviter's work. And here he is discussing something called expert systems. And expert systems really shows one of the most important new directions that AI took during this era. So the people who created expert systems thought that AI would be much more useful if you focused it much more succinctly on one specific problem. So instead of trying to build a broad human-like intelligence, many researchers began focusing on these narrower systems that could perform just one task, but incredibly well. And we'll see examples of this in fields like medicine. Expert systems are a great example of how AI became more practical, more limited, and in some ways more durable. And then our final core reading comes from Funding a Revolution, published in 1999. We read one other chapter from this last week. But the chapter that we read this week is going to help remind us that the history of AI is never just about ideas. It's also about institutions, money, priority, and government support. And you'll get a sense that that's one of the themes of this class, that all of these things combine to make AI what AI is in the past, present, and it will be for the future. So in this time period in the 70s and 80s, even when the AI field was facing criticism, these broader support structures like universities helped to keep it alive. And that is an incredibly important part of this story. As always, after we finish the core readings, you'll get an opportunity to select your own learning path for the week to dig deeper into areas that might interest you the most. The first one, the learning path A, is entitled Who Killed AI? So this learning path really focuses on the debate over whether AI's early problems were signs of true failure or signs that the field was simply misunderstood at the time. So here you're going to look more closely at the major criticisms of AI during this period, especially reflecting back on James Lighthill's famous attack on the field, along with responses from other people like Thomas Haigh and John McCarthy. This path, I think, is useful for people who want to understand how AI's reputation changed in the 1970s and 80s, why some people believed that the field had been overhyped and overpromised, and also why others argued that the field of AI was very much still alive in the 1970s and 1980s. It had just changed. The second learning path focuses on expert systems, which I just mentioned. And the title for this is Doctors and Databases. And this learning path really focuses on one of the most important ways that AI survived and evolved during this period. So as I just mentioned about expert systems, the goal here was to try to move away from trying to recreate general human intelligence, and instead researchers began to build these expert systems to perform very specialized tasks in narrow domains, much like medicine. Therefore, the title for this learning path, Doctors and Databases. By looking at examples like MYCIN, that's spelled MYCIN, you'll see how AI became more practical, more focused, and also how these successes raised new questions about the limits of these rule-based systems. So this path is ideal if you want to see what AI looked like when it was removed from the grand dreams of the pioneering era of the 50s and 60s and refocused on these specific programs like MYCIN. The final learning path takes us away from the United States and begins looking at the impact of AI on the world. And Learning Path C is entitled Japan's Big Bet, the fifth generation. So this looks at one of the most ambitious international efforts of the 1980s. This is Japan's fifth generation computer systems project. And so, again, within this context of people starting to think and starting to doubt the future of AI, Japan invested heavily in the idea that intelligent computing could reshape technology, industry, and propel them in global competition. If you want to take this path, I think that it helps us to understand that the story of AI in this period was not only about criticism and retrenchment and pulling back into narrower scopes of interest like expert systems, but it also had a continued ambition on a global scale now. So I think that this path it can be especially helpful if you want to understand how AI became attached to national strategy, and that national strategy would be Japan in this case, economic rivalry between nations, and also how AI could play into a vision for a future. Now, week 3 is a busy week because this week your first written assignment is due. And this week's first assignment gives you a chance to experiment with, I think, one of the most creative parts of this course, and that's entitled Conversations with AI Pioneers. You can see a list of the AI pioneers on the screen right now that you can choose from. And each of these and the link to them are a custom GPT simulation that I created for you to have a conversation with, a textual conversation with. So in this assignment, you're going to choose one AI persona from week 1 in our class and one persona from week 2, and you're going to interact with them in ChatGPT as historical simulations. Now, each of these personas only have the knowledge and assumptions of their own time. So if you select Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, she will have no idea who one of the AI pioneers from the 1950s, like Alan Turing, might be. Now, your goal is to not simply have a fun conversation, though I hope that you will have a fun conversation, but the goal is also to think critically about what these figures believed, what they could have known, what they maybe didn't know, and how their ideas connect to our readings on the origins of artificial intelligence. So then in your short assignment, your short paper, you're going to reflect on what you learned from these conversations. You're going to talk about how convincing or not convincing these personas felt, and you'll talk about whether the experience changed your understanding of them and their overall significance to the history of AI. Then when we pivot to the discussion question this week, you're going to share some of the experiences in these conversations with the rest of the class, and this represents your hands-on AI experience for the week. Now, I know your formal paper is not due till Sunday, and yet your initial discussion post is due on Thursday, so I'm not expecting a formal discussion or analysis or your final analysis of what you are going to conclude from your conversations with AI. Instead, I just want you to informally share with the class who you selected, so who you talked to from the list of week 1 or week 2. Did the interactions deepen your understanding of that figure? Did you like the exercise? Did you think it was helpful to think about the promises and the limitations of AI during each of these periods? And then on top of that, as if that wasn't enough, I know, your discussion this week asks you to engage directly with this week's central question of whether or not AI failed during the 1970s or 1980s, or whether or not it simply changed and adapted in important ways. And as you think about this question, of course, reflect on what you have learned about this period from our readings this week, about why AI's early hopes ran into trouble, and also confront and consider some ways that the AI field survived by changing direction. So by the end of the week, I hope you will see this as a moment in AI history that was not a complete collapse. It wasn't a complete AI winter. In many ways, it was a period of criticism, adaptation, change, reinvention. But you can still reflect back on that and overall consider that it was a failure when it's compared to the promises of the pioneers in the previous 2 decades. So I look forward to seeing which learning path you take this week. I look forward to hearing your reactions to the readings. I especially look forward to hearing about your experiences with talking to the AI founders in our simulated AI activity this week. And so I look forward to reconvening with you in discussion.